In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use the UTSOA Render Farm. So in this case, I'm using VRay, and this is 3ds Max. I have a camera set up. When I set up my cameras, I like to make sure I have a wide-angle lens, so any 24 or 20 millimeter, something that shows a little more perspective. And then the first thing you'll have to make sure is that you actually have a folder set up on the network under SOA-data. So right now my class is under my name, BIEG. If you double click on that, you should see all the students from my classes within there. And so you want to make sure you type this exact address into your file browser. So if you just copy the address, this is the actual address. So you want to open a new browser window, and in here you want to type in // SOA-data /big, and then you can find your folder in here. And the best thing to do is to make a shortcut of your folder by right-clicking on it and say Create Shortcut, and then drag that shortcut out into your desktop. So you can see right now my desktop shortcut is right here, and that way when you link all your files you can just find them on your desktop. It's a lot easier. So I'll go ahead and close that now and go back into Max. And so the next thing you want to do once you have your camera set up and you have a folder set up on the render farm is to make sure all your maps and your files are saved in the appropriate place. So to do that, you first want to open up your material editor, and anything that's a procedural map is fine, but any bitmap that you're using in your scene, this includes all the materials in your scene and even HDRIs, anything that's an actual image that's saved locally on your machine, you want to make sure is saved onto the hard drive, onto the network. So if you go back into this network, and I'll go into my folder here, all of you will have these folders. So you want to make sure your Max files are saved here, and all your maps are saved here, and then when you save your renders out, they're saved in this folder here. So to do that, if you're back in Max and you double click on one of these bitmaps, you'll see the link to the file directory where it's stored. So you want to copy and paste all your maps into that directory, then double click on each of these bitmaps, select here, and then browse by going to your desktop. If you find that shortcut, so here's my shortcut, and then find my name, in this case your name, and then find your maps folder, and then find that material that you copied and pasted, and then you open it. Your link should then show SOA data and link to your folder. You want to do this for every single bitmap, and even the HDRIs have to also be located there. So you can see my HDRI is also located there. Next, if you go to render setup, I've had the most luck using the VRay frame buffer. So and generally when you render, you're just kind of rendering with a standard frame window. But if you click here VRay, you'll see there's this option here called VRay frame buffer, and that's just basically a render window, but it works really well with the render farm. So I recommend enabling this, and then under here it says raw image file. You want to check this box, and then you want to browse. And here you want to browse for, if you go back to your desktop, you want to find your shortcut to your folder, and then go into your stills folder and just create a name here. The most important thing though is that you save this as an EXR file type. So make sure you select EXR file type. So you want to do that, and then just below, these are your render channels. So remember, if you open your material editor and go to your materials, right now I only have 2 materials in my scene. If you double click on one of these materials, you want to make sure you're using a different material ID up here, and then also a different one for this material. So every material should have a different ID. That way when you do your material IDs, you'll actually get that channel, and you can use it to adjust the levels of each material individually within Photoshop. So you want to make sure you do that. Save this as a different file name, but again, save it to that SOA folder, save it to your stills directory, and then save it as a new file type. This again I would save as an EXR file type, and then when you do that, you're going to get this pop-up that pops up, and you can see it says render elements. You can add and select your render element from the list, your VRay material ID, and then you can say OK. You might need to make sure that elements are active. So if you go back into render setup all the way to render elements, make sure it's elements are active, but deselect enable. You do not want that selected. Okay, so once that's all done, you can file and save as, and save it to your file, your folder. So I'm going to save it to my Max folder file. I'll save it there, and this should take a little bit of time because it's saving to the network. Okay, and once all that's done, you can submit it to the render farm. You have to use a lab computer that has RRender, otherwise it won't work. So you want to make sure when you open a computer it says RRender here. You can then hit RRender, submit scene. It should run through some scripts and then open up RRender, which is called Royal Render. So once that's open, you should get this little window. Looks something like this. You can see your cameras in there. In this case, I'm rendering camera 2, so I'm going to select that. The next thing you can do is actually assign it to different machines in Goldsmith. If you're rendering a very high resolution or a very complex model with a lot of geometry, you want to make sure that you select 16 gigabyte machines. So from the drop down you can select the 16 gigabytes. Typically it doesn't matter, but if for some reason it keeps crashing, then you can try this. But I would only really try this if it crashes. And then you can select different machines from the different labs we have. So I'll just go ahead and select all of these, and then you can assign the machines to the selected, and you really don't need to select all of them. You can just select, however many tiles you're doing, and say assign. And then over here on the right you can actually tile the image. So this will speed up the rendering time by breaking that image up and distributing it to different machines. So I'll just go ahead and select this. I think the max you can do is 10, but for this example I'll just do 4. And then I believe that's the last thing you can do. You can check your scene settings, make sure everything looks right up here. I tend to make sure I've done all this before I open the render farm, just so I'm sure it's going to work. But you can double check it here, and then once you're ready you can hit submit jobs, and that will send it to the render farm. Once you've submitted it to the render farm, you can actually view the progress of your render by going to this website here, SOA-render /. And then if you click on the rendering, you can actually see the progress of it, and you'll see which computers it went to and whether or not it's finished or not. And then finally, if you go into your folder on the network and then go into the file or the folder that you saved the stills, you should be actually able to see. So let's see if I go to date modified here. As they're rendered, they'll start to populate this folder, and then once they're finished you can actually open them in Photoshop. Sometimes it'll stitch the images together automatically, but if that doesn't work, then you'll have to bring them independently into Photoshop and then stitch them manually there. But that should work. One quick point, if you are running into a lot of crashes, one thing you might need to do is in Max, if you go to rendering render setup and go to settings, there's this little option here that says dynamic memory limit, and typically you won't have to change this, but if you do have a very complex scene with a lot of lights and a lot of geometry, you might really need to increase this number. The default's 400, but you could go up to like 8,000 or even 10,000 and then save that. And that can sometimes fix your model if you are running into crashes. So that's just a good kind of pointer. But otherwise, that's how you use the render farm. So once you get the files from the render farm, if it doesn't manually stitch them, which sometimes it doesn't, you can see that each of these are in separate files, and they're actually separate layers. And I've just brought them into this one image, and then I've tiled them manually. So it's okay. It doesn't take too long, but you'll see it'll kind of snap to the edges. So then you kind of take each tile and snap them together, and then once you have them all laid out, you can go ahead and go to layer and merge visible, and then they'll all be merged within one image. And you'll have to do that for the material ID and the rendering. It's a little bit of a pain, but not too bad. So then the next thing you do, this is really important, is that when you save as an EXR, it's a 32-bit image, and Photoshop can't handle 32-bit. It's like a little too much for it. So what you have to do is go to Image, Mode, and change this down to 16 bits. And then when you hit that, you say Merge, and then it'll give you this kind of pop-up, so you can actually control a lot of the values right here in this, and then say OK. And, it could change the highlights, for example. So you can actually do a lot of the adjustments on the fly and then say OK. And then you can start doing the different adjustments on the image. So you can start changing vibrance and stuff there. But that's the one thing you have to do when you save as an EXR.